Prince Joachim lost his crown and turned his home into a war zone. He brutally abused his wife until she fled. Then he shot himself. But death wasn't kind. He lingered in agonizing pain, a pathetic end for a man using violence to hide his weakness. Long before the bullet was fired, there was a birth celebrated by millions. Joachim Franz Humbert fell into the world on December 17, 1890, in Berlin. He was the sixth son of Kaiser Wilhelm II and Empress Augusta Victoria, the final piece of a dynastic puzzle that seemed unbreakable. In 1890, the German Empire was a young, muscular nation, flexed and ready to dominate the 20th century. It was a country of belching smokestacks, thundering trains, and a military machine that was the envy and terror of Europe. And at the very top of this pyramid of steel and iron sat the Kaiser. To be born a son of Wilhelm II was to be born into a very specific high-pressure atmosphere. The Kaiser was a man of intense, often manic energy, driven by deep-seated insecurities stemming from his withered left arm and a difficult relationship with his own mother. He compensated for his physical perceived weakness with a bombastic, hyper-masculine persona. He demanded that his sons be true Prussians, stoic, disciplined, militarily precise, and utterly devoid of softness. The older boys, particularly Crown Prince Wilhelm and Eitel Friedrich, bore the brunt of this expectation. They were drilled, criticized, and hardened from the moment they could walk. But Joachim was different. He was the baby. He arrived when the dynasty was secure, and perhaps the Kaiser's frantic need to prove his virility through his offspring had softened just enough to let a little affection through. From the start, Joachim was the favorite. The Kaiser, usually so quick to bark orders and point out flaws, melted around his youngest boy. He was often seen holding Joachim's hand in public, a rare display of paternal tenderness that baffled the older brothers. This favoritism was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it spared Joachim some of the psychological torment his brothers endured. On the other hand, it created a dangerous dependency. Joachim was shielded. He was the golden child, protected by the most powerful man in the world. He grew up believing that this protection was a law of nature, as immutable as gravity. He was never forced to develop the thick, callous skin that his brother Eitel possessed. He was a porcelain prince in an iron palace. His mother, Empress Augusta Victoria, known to the family as Donna, compounded this dynamic. She was the quintessential German mother of the era, pious, domestic, and fiercely protective. She adored all her sons, but Joachim, her Benjamin, held a special place in her heart. She worried over his health, fretted over his moods, and wrapped him in a cocoon of maternal devotion. While the Kaiser wanted a soldier, the Empress wanted a baby to keep. This tug-of-war between the demand for Prussian hardness and the reality of being a pampered favorite created a fissure in Joachim's personality that would only widen with time. He was trained to be a warrior, but he was raised as a pet. The education of a Prussian prince was a systematic process of depersonalization. At a young age, Joachim was sent to the Prinzenhaus at Plön, a cadet school designed to strip away individual eccentricity and replace it with the collective ethos of the officer corps. The curriculum was brutal and monotonous. Life was regulated by bells and bugles. There was no room for introspection, for art, or for personal doubt. A Prince of Prussia did not have feelings. He had duties. He was taught that his personal happiness was irrelevant compared to the glory of the state and the preservation of the House of Hohenzollern. At Plön, Joachim learned to ride, to shoot, to march, and to command. He looked the part. He grew into a tall, slender young man, perhaps not as physically imposing as his ancestors, but handsome in the sharp, aristocratic way that looked good on postcards. He wore the uniform well. In the official portraits from the early 1910s, you can see him staring down the lens with a mixture of arrogance and boredom. He stands with his hand on his sword hilt, his chest laden with medals he hadn't yet earned, projecting an image of unshakable confidence. But it was a performance. Inside the uniform was a young man who had never once had to make a real decision for himself. His meals were prepared, his clothes were laid out, his schedule was dictated, and his future was written in stone. He was a cog in a magnificent machine, unaware that the machine was being steered toward a cliff. The pre-war years, the era known as the Belle Époque, were a hallucination of stability. For Joachim and his circle, life was a continuous round of hunting parties at the hunting lodge in Rominton, sailing regattas at Kiel, and glittering balls in the white hall of the Berlin Palace. It was a world of strict hierarchy. Everyone knew their place. If you were a prince, people bowed. If you spoke, people listened. If you entered a room, the atmosphere changed. Viewed through the lens of modern democracy, the sheer intoxicating drug of royal deference seems alien. Yet it warped the mind completely. It convinced him that he was special not because of what he did, but simply because of what he was. Joachim internalized this completely. He believed the propaganda. He believed that the Hohenzollerns, ruled by divine right, that God himself had ordained his father to lead Germany. But underneath the waltzes and the champagne, there was a rotting emptiness. Joachim was prone to dark moods, sudden flashes of temper that mirrored his father's volatility. He was easily bored and easily slighted. There were whispers in court circles that the youngest prince was difficult, that he had a streak of melancholy that didn't fit the robust Prussian ideal. But in 1913, these were minor concerns. The empire was rich, the army was strong, and the future seemed bright. Then came the summer of 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was initially just another diplomatic crisis in the Balkans, a region that was always causing trouble. But the gears of the alliance systems, lubricated by decades of militarism and paranoia, began to turn. In Berlin, the mood shifted from concern to a strange, feverish excitement. The spirit of 1914 took hold. Crowds gathered in the Lustgarten singing patriotic songs, hungry for a fight that would finally prove German supremacy. For Joachim, this was what he had been born for. The uniform he had worn as a costume was now his work clothes. The sword was no longer a prop. He was 23 years old, a cavalry officer, and he was going to war. The Kaiser, caught up in his own delusions of grandeur, sent his sons off like medieval knights. "You will be home before the leaves fall," he famously promised. It was a lie, but it was a beautiful lie, and Joachim believed it. He rode out with the conviction of a man who thinks history is on his side. The reality of industrialized warfare strikes quickly and without mercy. Joachim was assigned to the front lines, not tucked away in a safe headquarters. To his credit, and contrary to the critics who called him soft, Joachim did not shy away from the danger. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to show his father that the favorite son was also a warrior. But the war in 1914 was not the war of cavalry charges and gallant duels that he had read about in his history books. It was a slaughterhouse. In September 1914, during the first battle of the Masurian Lakes on the Eastern Front, the reality of the conflict literally tore into him. A piece of Russian shrapnel ripped through his thigh. It was a messy, painful wound. He was evacuated from the field, bleeding and in shock. The reaction to his wounding reveals everything about the twisted priorities of the regime. It was treated as a magnificent propaganda opportunity. The Kaiser rushed to visit him in the field hospital. Photographs were taken of the emperor standing by the bedside of his wounded son, the Spartan father grieving but proud. The newspapers ran headlines extolling the prince's bravery. "The Hohenzollerns bleed with the people," they screamed. Joachim was awarded the Iron Cross, first class. But lying in that hospital bed, the pain throbbing in his leg, something in Joachim began to change. He had seen the bodies. He had smelled the gangrene and the cordite. He had heard the screams of men who didn't have emperors for fathers. The illusion of the fresh and joyous war had been shattered in seconds. He recovered physically. Prussian princes were expected to heal quickly, but the psychological wound was deeper. He returned to duty, but the innocence was gone. The darkness that had always lurked at the edges of his personality began to creep closer to the center. He was sent back to the front, but the war had stalled. The dynamic movement of 1914 turned into the grinding, soul-crushing stalemate of trench warfare. For a cavalry officer, this was particularly humiliating. Horses were useless against machine guns. The dashing charges were replaced by mud, lice, and boredom. Joachim found himself in a strange limbo. He was a prince, so he had to be protected, but he was an officer, so he had to lead. He floated between headquarters and the front, never truly belonging to the brotherhood of the trenches, yet no longer sheltered in the palace. It was during this period of disillusionment that the need for a distraction, for a connection to the old life, became overwhelming. The dynasty needed to project stability. They needed a wedding. In 1916, amidst the rationing and the casualty lists, an engagement was announced. Prince Joachim was to marry Princess Marie Auguste of Anhalt. She was 17 years old, a child, really. She was pretty, with wide eyes and a heritage that was impeccably royal. On paper, it was the perfect match, a union of two ancient German houses, a celebration of life in the midst of death. But the courtship was a sham. They hardly knew each other. Their meetings were chaperoned, brief, and dominated by the protocol of the court. Joachim was looking for a savior, someone to soothe the anxieties that the war had unleashed in him. He wanted a wife who would look at him with the same unconditional adoration his mother did. Marie Auguste, on the other hand, was likely dazzled by the idea of marrying the Kaiser's favorite son. She saw the glitter of the position, not the broken man beneath it. The wedding took place at Bellevue Palace in Berlin in March 1916. It was a subdued affair compared to the pre-war extravaganzas, but it was still a display of defiance. The Kaiser toasted the couple. The elite of Berlin turned out in their finest, trying to ignore the fraying cuffs of their uniforms and the hollow look in the eyes of the returning officers. Joachim and Marie Auguste stood at the altar, two young people pledging their lives to each other while the world burned down around them. They were actors in a play that the audience had already stopped believing in. The tragedy of their marriage was written before the ink on the certificate was dry. Joachim didn't need a partner. He needed a nurse, a therapist, and a subordinate. He brought the trauma of the front and the arrogance of his upbringing into the marital bed. He expected Marie Auguste to be docile, to cater to his foul moods, to understand his sudden silences. But Marie Auguste was a teenager, full of life, and confused by the suffocating atmosphere of the Prussian court. She had married a prince, but she found herself living with a patient, They had a son, Karl Franz Joseph, born in late 1916. The birth of an heir should have cemented the marriage, but it only highlighted the cracks. Joachim was jealous of the attention the baby received. He was possessive and controlling. As the war dragged on into 1917 and 1918, and the German population began to starve, the atmosphere in the palaces turned poisonous. The people were turning against the Kaiser. The cheers that had greeted Joachim in 1914 were replaced by sullen stares and muttered insults when his car passed through the streets. He took this public rejection personally. He had bled for them. He was their prince. How dare they question his family? His rage, impotent against the shifting tides of history, was turned inward toward his home. The Villa Liegnitz, their residence in Potsdam, became a prison. Joachim began to drink heavily, and the erratic behavior whispered about before the war became undeniable. He was unraveling. And then came November 1918, the month that the sky fell. The collapse of the German Empire was not a slow decline, it was a sudden, violent implosion. The sailors in Kiel mutinied. The revolution spread like wildfire through the cities. In Berlin, the masses poured into the streets, waving red flags. The army, the bedrock of Joachim's existence, disintegrated. On November 9, 1918, Chancellor Max von Baden announced the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser, fearing for his life, fled to the Netherlands by train. He didn't tell his sons he was leaving until it was almost done. He simply abandoned the ship. For Joachim, this was the ultimate betrayal. The father who had been a god, the man who had demanded absolute loyalty and strength, had run away. The emperor had deserted. The shock was cataclysmic. Joachim stayed behind in a Germany that had transformed overnight into a republic. The House of Hohenzollern was no longer the ruling family. They were private citizens with a lot of enemies and a lot of baggage. The psychological impact of the abdication on Joachim cannot be overstated. His entire identity was constructed around his rank. Without the HRH in front of his name, he didn't know who he was. He was trained to command a regiment, not to navigate a subway map or pay a utility bill. He was a creature of a specific ecosystem that had been paved over. While his older brothers, particularly the Crown Prince, attempted to salvage some political influence or scheme to restore the monarchy, Joachim retreated. He lacked the political cunning of Eitel or the popularity of the Crown Prince. He felt stripped of his armor. The loss of his titles felt like a physical assault. He was paranoid, believing that the revolutionaries were coming to drag him to the guillotine. He sent frantic letters, obsessing over money, over security, over the humiliation of being a nobody. The post-war period brought hyperinflation, political violence, and a national sense of shame. Germany was the pariah of the world, branded with the war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles. As a Hohenzollern, Joachim was the living embodiment of that guilt. He couldn't walk down the street without seeing the devastation his family's war had caused. The mutilated veterans begging on the corners were his former soldiers. The starving children were his former subjects. The pressure cooker of the Villa Liegnitz finally exploded. The marriage to Marie Auguste, barely held together by protocol during the war, disintegrated in the chaos of the peace. Joachim became a tyrant in his own home. If he couldn't rule Germany, he would rule his wife with an iron fist. The residence was consumed by a terrifying volatility. Fits of screaming echoed through the halls. Objects were smashed in blind rage, and the threat of physical violence hung heavy in the air. He was terrified she would leave him, and his terror manifested as brutality. Marie Auguste, however, was not her mother-in-law. She was young, she was modern, and she saw a way out. The Weimar Constitution granted rights to women that the empire never had. Divorce was no longer a dynastic impossibility. It was a legal procedure. She looked at her husband, a broken, angry, dangerous man obsessed with a dead past, and she made a choice for her own survival. She took their son, and she left. This was the death blow. It wasn't the bullet that killed Prince Joachim. It was the silence that followed her departure. When Marie Auguste filed for divorce, she stripped him of the last vestige of his manhood. He had failed as a soldier, failed as a prince, and now he had failed as a husband and father. The shame was unbearable. By the early summer of 1920, Joachim was a ghost haunting his own life. He wandered the empty rooms of the Villa Liegnitz, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who seemed to mock him. He was drowning in a deep clinical depression that no one at the time had the vocabulary or the tools to treat. His brother Idol visited him and reported back to the Kaiser that Joachim was in a state of excessive grief, but the family was helpless. They were all scattered, all dealing with their own ruin. No one saw just how close to the edge he really was. On that final night in July, Joachim attended a dinner. He drank, he laughed too loudly, he stared into space. He was saying goodbye, though no one realized it. He went home to the empty villa. The silence pressed in on him. There was no royal guard at the gate, no adjutant waiting for orders. Just the dark and the desk and the drawer where he kept his service pistol. He didn't do it to make a statement. He didn't leave a manifesto. He did it because the pain of being Prince Joachim of Prussia in a world without Prussia was simply too great to bear. He picked up the Luger. He didn't aim for his head. He aimed for his chest. Perhaps he wanted to stop the heart that had been broken so many times. The gunshot ended the life of the Kaiser's favorite son, but it started a new chapter in the dark history of a family that had flown too high and fallen too far. The smoke cleared, but the tragedy was only just beginning. The sound of the shot was not loud enough to shatter the windows of the Villa Liegnitz, nor did it echo far into the humid night of Potsdam. It was a dull, flat crack, swallowed almost instantly by the heavy velvet drapes and the thick Prussian masonry. But in the psychic landscape of the Hohenzollern dynasty, that single report was a thunderclap that would reverberate for decades. It was the sound of the final collapse. In the immediate silence that followed, there was a terrible suspended moment where history held its breath. The servants, accustomed to the erratic noises of their master's dark moods, the shattering of glass, the slamming of doors, might have paused, hoping it was just another fit of temper. But the stillness that settled over the study was different. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of finality. When the door was finally forced open, the smell of cordite, sharp, metallic, and unmistakably the scent of the trenches, would have hit them before the sight of the prince. Joachim lay slumped, the life bleeding out of him onto the floor of a house that was no longer a palace, but a tomb of his own making. The Luger, that efficient tool of the German war machine, had done its work, but it had not been instant. The tragedy of Joachim was that even his death was messy, a lingering, painful transition rather than a clean break. He was still breathing, ragged and shallow when they found him. The panic that ensued was a microcosm of the chaos that had engulfed his entire world since 1918. There were frantic shouts, the rushing of feet, the desperate summoning of a doctor who could do nothing to repair a soul that had been broken long before the bullet entered the body. They rushed him to St. Joseph's Hospital in Potsdam. The once revered son of the Kaiser was now just a dying man in a speeding car, rattling over the cobblestones of a city trying to sleep off the hangover of a lost war. There were no royal outriders, no flags flying at half-mast, just the frantic urgency of a family trying to outrun the inevitable. At the hospital, the doctors worked with the grim professionalism of men who had spent 4 years patching up the wreckage of the Western Front. But the wound was catastrophic. Prince Joachim of Prussia, the last favorite of the exiled emperor, died shortly after arrival. He was 29 years old. The time was roughly after midnight, July 18th, 1920. The news did not travel with the speed of modern digital fire, but it moved with the relentless weight of a tidal wave. First, it whispered through the hospital corridors. Then, it was telephoned to the remaining family members in Germany. Prince Eitel Friedrich, Joachim's older brother, and perhaps the closest thing he had to a stabilizer in those final years, was among the first to know. Eitel was a hard man, a soldier's soldier who had absorbed the shock of the abdication by stiffening his spine and narrowing his eyes. But this broke him. To lose a brother in combat was a glorious sacrifice. To lose him to suicide in a sordid post-war depression was a humiliation that cut deeper than any treaty. The telegram that was sent to Doorn in the Netherlands carried a payload heavier than any artillery shell. Hoosdoorn was the modest manor house where Kaiser Wilhelm II lived in exile. Since fleeing Germany in November 1918, the former all-highest warlord had been reduced to the status of a wealthy, grumpy country squire. He spent his days chopping wood, thousands of logs, obsessively, furiously, as if by dismantling the Dutch forests he could dismantle the memory of his failure. He had grown a beard, softening the sharp waxed mustache that had once been the caricature of villainy for the entire Allied world. He was an old man, hollowed out by history. When the telegram arrived, the Kaiser was not the bombastic orator of 1914. He was a father. Witnesses described a collapse that was terrifying to behold. Wilhelm II had always been a man of theatrical emotions, prone to great highs and abyssal lows, but this was different. Joachim was his Benjamin, the baby, the one son who had seemingly offered him unconditional love, unpolluted by political maneuvering. The Kaiser reportedly aged years in minutes. He wept openly, a display of vulnerability that would have been unthinkable in the Berlin palace. "My poor boy," he was heard to murmur over and over, "my poor lost boy." But the grief in Doorn was complicated by a darker, more corrosive emotion, guilt. The Kaiser knew in the quiet corners of his conscience that he had created the world that destroyed his son. He had built the militaristic pressure cooker. He had declared the war, and ultimately, he was the one who had run away, leaving his children to face the wrath of a broken Germany alone. Joachim's suicide was an accusation. It was a bullet fired not just at a prince's heart, but at the Kaiser's legacy. Even more tragic was the reaction of the Empress Augusta Victoria. She was already dying. Her health had been shattered by the war, by the revolution, and by the exile. She was frail, her heart failing, living on a mixture of denial and religious faith. The news of Joachim's death was the final blow. It is no exaggeration to say that the bullet that killed Joachim also killed his mother. It just took her a few months longer to die. She collapsed into a state of shock from which she never truly recovered. The family tried to shield her from the grisly details, perhaps telling her it was an accident or a sudden illness. But the truth has a way of seeping through the walls. She knew. The mother's intuition that had made her dote on Joachim told her that her sensitive, fragile boy had finally shattered. Back in Germany, the public reaction was a volatile cocktail of shock, pity, and vicious satisfaction. The Berlin newspapers, now free from imperial censorship, splashed the story across the front pages. "The tragedy of the Hohenzollerns," they screamed. "Suicide of the Kaiser's son." For the ardent monarchists, and there were still many, it was a day of national mourning. They saw Joachim as a martyr, a symbol of the German soul, tortured by the shameful Peace of Versailles. They gathered outside the Villa Liegnitz, leaving flowers and weeping, projecting their own loss of national identity onto the dead prince. But for the Republicans, the Socialists, and the Communists, Joachim's death was a grim vindication. It was proof that the old system was rotten to the core. They argued that the Hohenzollerns were not supermen ordained by God, but weak, unstable parasites who couldn't survive a day in the real world without their servants and their titles. He could send millions to die, one socialist pamphlet read, but he could not live as a man himself. The suicide stripped away the last vestiges of the divine mystery of kingship. It revealed the biological, psychological frailty of the dynasty. The funeral, held a few days later in Potsdam, was a surreal event. It was a pageant of ghosts. In 1913, a royal funeral would have been attended by the crowned heads of Europe, kings of England, czars of Russia, emperors of Austria. But in July 1920, the kings were dead, deposed, or enemies. The Tsar was a pile of bones in a mine shaft in Siberia. The Austrian emperor was in exile. The King of England was certainly not coming. Instead, the mourners were a ragtag collection of the old crowd, generals in civilian clothes who looked uncomfortable without their medals, former court officials who were now struggling to pay rent. The remaining brothers, Eitel Friedrich, Adalbert, August Wilhelm, Oscar, stood by the grave, looking like survivors of a shipwreck huddled on a life raft. They wore their uniforms, but the insignia felt different now. It felt like a costume from a canceled play. The most glaring absence was the father. The Kaiser was forbidden from entering Germany. He could not bury his favorite son. He had to mourn from a distance, performing a parallel service in the chapel at Dorn, thousands of miles away from the damp earth of the antique temple in Sanssouci Park, where Joachim was laid to rest. This physical separation underscored the total defeat of the family. They couldn't even mourn together, and there, amidst the black veils and the weeping, stood Marie Auguste, the ex-wife, the woman who had fled. The tension radiating from the Hohenzollern family toward her must have been palpable. To the brothers, and certainly to the Kaiser in Dorn, she was the villain of the piece. In their narrative, she was the one who had abandoned Joachim in his hour of need. She was the one who had taken the child. She was the trigger. It was a convenient narrative, of course. It was easier to blame a heartless woman than to blame the war, the collapse of the monarchy, or the untreated mental illness that had plagued Joachim for years. Marie Auguste stood her ground, perhaps out of duty, perhaps out of a lingering love for the man he had been before the darkness took him completely. She held the hand of little Karl Franz Joseph, who was not yet 4 years old. The boy stared at the coffin, too young to understand that his father had just become a footnote in a history book, and that his own life would forever be defined by this moment. He was the heir to nothing but a tragedy. As the coffin was lowered into the crypt of the antique temple, a heavy rain began to fall, turning the paths of Sanssouci into mud. It was fitting. The Sun King imagery of the early reign of Wilhelm II was long gone. This was the era of gray rain and gray realities. The weeks following the funeral were a period of settling dust, but the dust was toxic. The suicide had exposed the financial ruin of the family. Joachim had been terrified of poverty, and while the Hohenzollerns were not starving, their assets were frozen or contested. The Weimar Republic was engaged in a legal battle with the former royals over the Fürstenabfindung, the compensation for lost territories and palaces. Joachim's death weakened the family's negotiating position. It made them look unstable. If the princes were killing themselves, perhaps the family didn't deserve the millions of marks they were demanding. Prince Eitel Friedrich, who emerged as the de facto head of the family in Germany, tried to lock down the narrative. He ordered Joachim's papers to be sealed or destroyed. Any suicide notes, any diaries detailing his depression or his rage at the Kaiser were likely fed to the fire. The House of Hohenzollern would not allow the public to see the true extent of the rot. They spun the story. Joachim had died of honor. He had died of a broken heart for his country. They tried to turn a mental health crisis into a patriotic sacrifice, but they couldn't control the whispers. Berlin was a city of rumors. People talked about the drugs Joachim might have been taking. They talked about the violent arguments at the Villa Liegnitz. They talked about his involvement with women of questionable repute in the final months. The image of the Golden Prince was tarnished beyond repair. For the Kaiser, the grief hardened into a bitter, calcified hatred of the New World Order. He blamed the Jews, the Socialists, the Freemasons, anyone but himself, for the death of his son. He began to write furiously, his memoirs becoming a revisionist history where he was the victim of a global conspiracy. Joachim's death radicalized the old man. It pushed him further into the dark, paranoid fantasies that would characterize his final decades. He stopped being a tragic figure and became a pathetic one, railing against the storm from the safety of his Dutch manor. Meanwhile, the Empress faded rapidly. The will to live had simply evaporated. By April 1921, less than a year after Joachim's suicide, Empress Augusta Victoria passed away. Her funeral was the next time the family gathered, and the shadow of Joachim was everywhere. They were burying the mother, but they were still mourning the son. The double blow decimated the family's spirit. The Kaiser was now a widower and a bereaved father, alone in a foreign land. But life, with its cruel indifference to human suffering, continued. The 1920s roared into life. Jazz music began to play in the nightclubs of Berlin, drowning out the funeral dirges. The hyperinflation of 1923 was on the horizon, a storm that would wipe out the savings of the middle class and make the problems of princes seem trivial by comparison. Yet, in the quiet corners of the royal palaces that remained, a new problem was brewing. It centered on the child, Karl Franz Joseph. He was the only son of the favorite son. He was the living link to Joachim. And now he was in the sole custody of Marie Auguste, a woman the family despised. The battle for the boy's soul was about to begin. The Hohenzollerns were not done with him yet. They had lost the father to the void. They were determined not to lose the son to the mother. Eitel Friedrich, childless himself and fiercely loyal to the dynastic idea, began to turn his attention to his nephew. He saw in the little boy a chance for redemption. If they could raise Karl Franz Joseph as a true Prussian, they could perhaps undo the shame of Joachim's failure. They could prove that the bloodline was not tainted. It was a dangerous ambition. They wanted to take a child who had already lost his father to the crushing weight of expectation and subject him to the exact same pressure. As the winter of 1920 set in, the Villa Liegnitz stood empty, its windows dark, but the ghost of Prince Joachim had not left. He had simply moved into the minds of his survivors. He was the warning they ignored. He was the silence at the dinner table. He was the proof that even the highest walls cannot keep out the darkness when it grows from within. The Weimar Republic was fragile, a democracy built on sand. And in the shadows, waiting for their moment, were forces far darker than the monarchists. The story of Joachim is often read as the end of something, the end of the empire. But in reality, it was a prologue. It was the first act in a German tragedy that would spiral down into depths that even the most pessimistic observer in 1920 could not have imagined. The pistol shot was over. The echo had faded. But the bleeding had only just begun. The years that followed Prince Joachim's suicide were a strange, feverish twilight for the House of Hohenzollern. While the rest of the world was desperately trying to scrub the blood of the Great War from its hands and dance into the Jazz Age, the German royals were frozen in a tableau of grief and resentment. They were like actors on a stage where the curtain had already fallen, still reciting lines to an empty theater. The Villa Liegnitz remained a scar on the landscape of Potsdam, a physical reminder of the tragedy, but the true damage was invisible. It was metastasizing in the hearts of the survivors. Berlin in the early 1920s was a city of ghosts and neon. It was the era of Babylon Berlin, a frantic, hedonistic explode of culture, vice, and desperate energy. The old Prussian values of duty, austerity, and discipline, the very values Joachim had died trying to uphold, were now openly mocked in the cabarets. Women cut their hair short, men wore lipstick, and the currency lost its value so fast that a wheelbarrow of marks couldn't buy a loaf of bread. For the Hohenzollerns, watching this from their country estates, it was proof that the apocalypse had arrived. They didn't see a society trying to heal. They saw a sewer that needed to be flushed. And at the center of this cultural collision was the boy, Karl Franz Joseph. He was 4 years old when his father pulled the trigger, 5 when his grandmother died of a broken heart. He was a child constructed of tragedy. To the public, he was a sympathetic figure, the orphan prince. To his mother, Marie Auguste, he was the only thing that mattered, her anchor in a storm of hostility. But to his uncles, specifically Eitel Friedrich and the increasingly radicalized August Wilhelm, he was something else entirely. He was a political asset. He was the heir to the favorite son. He was a blank slate upon which they could rewrite the history of their family. The custody battle that raged over Karl Franz Joseph was not fought with love. It was fought with ideology. The Weimar court, still populated by conservative judges who sympathized with the old order, tended to favor the patriarchal rights of the father's family, even if the father was dead. The Hohenzollern family lawyers, funded by the vast, though frozen, wealth of the dynasty, argued that a prince of Prussia could not be raised by a modern woman like Marie Auguste. They argued that she was too flighty, too liberal, too disconnected from the German spirit. They painted her attempt to move on from the tragedy, to live a life that wasn't a perpetual funeral, as evidence of moral laxity. In a heartbreaking compromise that felt more like a seizure, the family gained significant control over the boy's education and upbringing. Karl Franz Joseph was effectively drafted. He was taken from the warmth of his mother's world and plunged into the frigid machinery of the Prussian cadet lifestyle, a lifestyle that had already ground his father into dust. He was sent to schools that were incubators for the old military elite, places where teachers still bowed to the empty portraits of the Kaiser, and where the Republic was spoken of as a temporary sickness. Imagine the confusion of a 6-year-old boy. He is told that his father was a hero, a martyr who died of honor, when in reality he died of despair. He is told that his grandfather, the terrifying old man with the beard chopping wood in Holland, is the rightful ruler of Germany. He is told that his mother, the woman who smells of perfume and life, is dangerous. Karl Franz Joseph learned to compartmentalize. He learned to stand straight, to click his heels, to hide his emotions. He was becoming a little replica of Joachim, but with a thicker shell. The family was trying to clone the dead prince, but strip out the weakness. It was a cruel experiment. While the boy was being molded, the uncles were searching for a path back to power. The 1920s were a period of intense political homelessness for the German right wing. They hated the communists, they despised the Social Democrats, and they had no faith in the weak centrist parties. They wanted a strong man. They wanted a restoration. Prince Eitel Friedrich, the second son, became the face of the Stahlhelm, a paramilitary organization of WWI veterans. He marched in parades, a fat, scowling figure in a steel helmet, trying to keep the flame of the monarchy alive. But Eitel was a man of the past. He lacked charisma. He was too tied to the failure of 1918. The people respected his rank, but they didn't follow him. It was the fourth son, Prince August Wilhelm, known to the family as Aui, who found the new path. And it was a path that led straight into the abyss. Aui had always been a bit of an outsider, artistic and impressionable. After the collapse of the monarchy and the suicide of Joachim, he felt a profound sense of uselessness. He was looking for a cause that could give him the same rush of adrenaline that the empire once did. He found it in a Munich beer hall agitator named Adolf Hitler. The seduction of the Hohenzollerns by the Nazis is one of the most grotesque chapters in this story. It began slowly. In the mid-1920s, the Nazis were a fringe group, a bunch of thugs in brown shirts. But as the economy crashed again in 1929 and the Great Depression strangled Germany, Hitler's message of national vengeance began to resonate. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. He promised to restore German pride. He promised to crush the communists. To the Hohenzollerns, Hitler looked like a useful tool. They were blinded by their own arrogance. They thought they could use this Austrian corporal as a battering ram to destroy the Republic, and then once the dust settled, they would push him aside and put the Kaiser, or perhaps the Crown Prince, or even young Karl Franz Joseph, back on the throne. It was a delusion of staggering proportions. They invited the wolf into the sheepfold because they thought they could put a leash on him. August Wilhelm joined the Nazi Party in 1930. He was given the membership number 24,000, a low number indicating his early enthusiasm. He didn't just join, he became a poster boy. He traveled the country speaking at Nazi rallies. It was a grotesque spectacle. A prince of Prussia, a son of the Kaiser, standing on a platform next to Joseph Goebbels, shouting Heil Hitler. The symbolism was potent. It gave the Nazis a veneer of respectability they desperately needed. It told the conservative middle class, it's okay to vote for these thugs. Even the emperor's son is with them. For Marie Auguste, watching from the sidelines, this must have been terrifying. The family that had taken her son was now aligning itself with a movement that celebrated violence and hatred. She was powerless to stop it. She saw Karl Franz Joseph being paraded at events dressed in youth uniforms, shaking hands with men who would soon burn Europe to the ground. The boy was being groomed not just as a Prussian, but as a pawn in a fascist game. The tragedy of Joachim was replaying itself in a new key. Joachim had died because He couldn't adapt to a world without an emperor. His brothers were now trying to build a world with a dictator, hoping it would feel the same. They were chasing a phantom. In Dorn, the exiled Kaiser was conflicted. He despised the vulgarity of the Nazis. He called them a bunch of shirt-sleeve gangsters. But he loved their success. He loved that they were terrified of the left. He loved that they were rearming Germany. When Aoi came to visit him, wearing his SA brown shirt, the Kaiser didn't throw him out. He listened. He let himself be flattered. He let himself believe the lie that Hitler would give him his crown back. It was the final vanity of a dying old man. As the 1930s dawned, the shadow of Joachim's suicide seemed to stretch longer. The mental health struggles that had killed him were not unique. The entire nation was undergoing a mental breakdown. The collective trauma of the war, suppressed for a decade, was erupting in the form of mass hysteria. The suicide rate in Germany skyrocketed during the Depression. Joachim had been the canary in the coal mine. Now the whole mine was collapsing. Karl Franz Joseph, now a teenager, was caught in the middle of this psychosis. He was a quiet boy, described by contemporaries as polite but distant. He had his father's eyes, melancholic, searching. He was aware of the manner of his father's death, though it was rarely spoken of. Suicide was a sin in the eyes of the church and a weakness in the eyes of the army. He carried the shame of it like a backpack he couldn't take off. He felt the pressure to be tougher than Joachim, to prove that the bad blood hadn't passed to him. In 1933, the dam broke. Hitler became chancellor. The Weimar Republic was dead. The Hohenzollern celebrated. They threw parties. They toasted the national awakening. The crown prince, Wilhelm, publicly supported Hitler. Aoi was elected to the Reichstag as a Nazi deputy. They thought their moment had come, but Hitler had played them for fools. Once he had absolute power, he had no need for a dusty old monarchy. He didn't want a Kaiser. He wanted to be the Kaiser. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934, where Hitler purged his own party and killed conservative critics, sent a chill through the royal family. They realized too late that they were not the masters of the beast. They were its pets, and pets can be put down. Marie Auguste, meanwhile, had been quietly fighting her own war for survival. Denied the financial support she felt she was owed, and ostracized by high society, she had to be resourceful. She was a modern woman in a way the Hohenzollerns couldn't understand. She took lovers. She traveled. She engaged in business schemes that the royals found vulgar. At one point, facing financial ruin, she began a practice that would later become her most controversial legacy. She accepted money to adopt adults, giving them a royal title in exchange for cash. It was a deconstruction of royalty that would have made Joachim spin in his grave. He had died because he couldn't live without the dignity of his title. His widow was selling that dignity to the highest bidder just to pay the rent. It was a grotesque irony, but it was also a form of revenge. She was selling off the pieces of the system that had destroyed her husband, but in the mid-1930s her focus was still on her son. Karl Franz Joseph was entering adulthood. The Third Reich demanded service. He joined the Wehrmacht, the regular army. It was inevitable. A Prince of Prussia had to be an officer. He put on the field gray uniform, the steel helmet, the jack boots. He looked like his father in 1914. The cycle was closing. The family pushed him toward a suitable marriage. In 1940, as the world was once again plunging into war, Karl Franz Joseph married Princess Henriette of Schönau-Karolath. It was a good match by royal standards. Although Henriette was the stepdaughter of his own uncle, the Kaiser's second wife, Hermine. The family tree was twisting in on itself, becoming a suffocating knot of intermarriage and shared trauma. The wedding took place during the early victories of World War II. Germany was conquering France. The shame of 1918 was being erased by the Panzers. For a brief shining moment, the Hohenzollerns thought they had won. They thought Joachim's ghost could finally rest, because the German eagle was flying high again. But they were celebrating a corpse. The Germany they loved, the Germany of honor, of tradition, of Christian monarchy, was dead. It was being worn as a skin by a nihilistic death cult. Karl Franz Joseph went to war, just as his father had. He served on the Eastern Front, the same brutal theater where Joachim had been wounded. But this was a different war. It was a war of extermination. The atrocities committed in the East were not the collateral damage of 1914. They were policy. We do not know how much Karl Franz Joseph saw or how much he participated in. We know he was an officer in an armored reconnaissance unit. He was in the thick of it. Did he think of his father in those frozen Russian winters? Did he look at the devastation and understand finally the despair that had led Joachim to the pistol? The irony is acute. Joachim killed himself because he lost a war. His son was fighting a war that would destroy what little was left of the family's honor. In 1941, the exiled Kaiser died in Dorn. He died while German troops were occupying the Netherlands, guarding his gate. He died thinking Germany was winning, but knowing he would never sit on the throne again. Hitler sent a wreath, but he didn't come to the funeral. The monarchy was truly history now. Karl Franz Joseph was now the grandson of a dead emperor, fighting for a Führer who despised him. The war ground on. The tide turned. The euphoria of 1940 turned into the meat grinder of 1943 and 1944. The cities of Germany were being pulverized by Allied bombers. The Villa Liegnitz, where Joachim had died, sat in the center of a target zone. The physical world of the Hohenzollerns was being erased brick by brick. And then the family suffered another blow, one that echoed the past with eerie precision. The Nazis, paranoid after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, turned on the aristocracy. They suspected the old noble families of being disloyal. The prince's decree, Prinzenerlass, was issued, discharging members of former royal houses from the Wehrmacht. Hitler didn't want them to be heroes. He didn't want a Hohenzollern to return from the front covered in glory and challenge his authority. Karl Franz Joseph was kicked out of the army. He was stripped of his command, not for incompetence, but for his blood. It was a replay of 1918. Once again, a Hohenzollern prince was told he was unwanted. Once again, his identity as a soldier was ripped away. But this time, there was no palace to retreat to. There was only a burning Germany, shrinking every day as the Soviets advanced from the east and the Americans from the west. He returned to a civilian life that didn't exist. He had a wife and now children of his own, born in the early 40s, but no future. He watched as his uncle Aui, the Nazi prince, realized too late that he had bet on the wrong horse. Aui would eventually be arrested by the Americans, a pathetic figure claiming he didn't know about the crimes of the regime. The war ended in 1945, not with a ceasefire, but with total annihilation. The Red Army swept through Potsdam. The Villa Liegnitz was looted. The grave of Joachim in the antique temple was behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets had no love for dead princes. The estate was seized, the treasures stolen or smashed. Karl Franz Joseph survived the war, but he was a man adrift. He had lost his grandfather's empire, his father's legacy, and now his own country was divided in two. He divorced his wife Henriette in 1946. The pattern of broken marriages continued. The trauma was generational, a baton passed from hand to hand. But unlike Joachim, Karl Franz Joseph did not pick up a pistol. Perhaps he had seen enough death. Perhaps the sheer scale of the world's suffering made his own seem manageable. Or perhaps, simply, he had learned the lesson that Joachim never could, that a title is just a word, and a man must find a way to live, even when the history books say he is obsolete. He drifted into a quiet, obscure life. He remarried, this time morganatically, to a commoner, which would have horrified his grandfather, but was the only sane choice left. He lived until 1975, dying in West Germany, a relic of a relic. But the story of Joachim didn't end with his son's survival. It ended with the complete dispersal of the illusion. The House of Hohenzollern, once the masters of Europe, became just another family of wealthy socialites, bickering over inheritance and appearing in gossip magazines. The suicide of 1920 was the moment the facade cracked. Everything that followed, the flirtation with Nazism, the Second War, the loss of the Eastern lands, was just the building crumbling into the sea. Joachim was the first to realize that the play was over. He left the stage before the horror of the second act began. In a twisted way, he was the lucky one. He never had to see a swastika flying over his father's palace. He never had to see the smoke rising from the camps. He died with the illusion of honor still intact in his mind, however shattered it was. His death remains a singular point of sorrow, a pinprick of personal darkness in a century of industrial-scale slaughter. It reminds us that behind the maps and the treaties, history is made by people. Fragile, broken, frightened people who sometimes find themselves standing in a room with a gun, unable to face the morning. Today, the Villa Liegnitz still stands in Potsdam. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected and renovated. Tourists walk past it, admiring the architecture, mostly unaware of the gunshot that once cracked inside its walls. The antique temple where Joachim lies is quiet. For decades during the Cold War, it was inaccessible to the family, locked away in East Germany. The ivy grew over the stones. The name Joachim on the sarcophagus gathered dust. Marie Auguste lived until 1983. She became a minor celebrity in the post-war years, a princess for hire in the jet-set era, a woman who adapted to the commodification of royalty with cynical brilliance. She adopted the adult husband of Zsa Zsa Gabor, Frederick Prince von Anhalt, giving him the title he uses today. It was a final farcical twist. The title that Joachim died for was sold for a check. In the end, the story of Prince Joachim is a warning about the danger of defining yourself by what you own, rather than who you are. He was a prince. That was all he was. And when the prince died, the man had to follow. The silence of the Villa Liegnitz is not empty. It is filled with the question that Joachim asked the world in 1920, a question we are still asking today. When the world changes faster than we can, how do we survive?